In a recent quarterly essay entitled Uncivil Wars, How Contempt is Corroding Democracy, Waleed and Scott Stevens addressed the contemporary phenomenon that every demographic feels victimised and every issue draws sharp lines between us. Opposing sides consider themselves shamed or cancelled and regard the others as bullies and deplorables. Outrage and contempt are the emotions of the age. This undermines our ability to dialogue and govern, and I would add, render justice. Indeed, it threatens our ability to relate even to our nearest and dearest. SBS recently published a comment piece on how to survive your conservative relatives this Christmas. This omnipresent contempt corrupts our politics, journalism, common life. The authors argue that for democracy to flourish, including, I dare say, our justice system, citizens must relate less like gladiatorial opponents and more like spouses, bound together by reciprocal devotion and hopefully discovering and practicing the ethical conditions for their union to persist. In particular, they conclude, we must learn again habits of patience, reciprocity, and free exchange. Jesus famously echoed the Levitical teaching that we must love our neighbours as ourselves. He said he thought the whole of the law, including the civil law, hung on this commandment, and the one to love God before all else. Sometimes people take this to mean loving others as much or in the same way as they love themselves. But that's a very imperfect measure, given how disordered self-love can be and how often people have low self-esteem or even self-hatred. So let's examine that teaching a little more closely. First, who is the teaching for? The Lord tells Moses, "Speak to the whole community of the children of Israel." In other words, this teaching is for everyone. We are not divided into castes of the righteous elite and the beasts incapable of fulfilling the law, nor are some above the law and others its slaves. We are moral equals by virtue of being created in the image of God. All human beings are called to fulfill the commandments that regulate our neighbourliness. Secondly, what is this neighbourliness? Moses and Jesus say it is at its core an imitation of the way God loves. Be holy as God is holy, Moses says. Be perfect as God is perfect, Jesus says. Of course, neither expects we'll ever achieve this. But conforming our hearts and minds, actions and relationships to God's will founds the habits so sorely needed for a healthy common life. Thirdly, Moses gives some examples of this godlike regard. Respecting each other's property and other entitlements, care for the weak, honesty in dealings, no perjury, slander, or partiality in courts, no hatreds or vengeance nursed in hearts. A community founded not on contempt, but on practical, neighbourly love. When newly Pope, St. John Paul II proposed that the purpose of law is not just regulating a society so it is predictable and orderly, also rights are respected and responsibilities fulfilled, also people are shielded from arbitrary power. No, law must also cultivate a certain kind of character. Law plays a role, he said, that is the highest degree educative, both of individuals and of society. For people to come into being and mature in an integral way, they need such an ordered and fruitful environment. Of course, few would deny the educative power of law. But John Paul's thought was that learning the rules and to do what you're told is not enough. We must understand what underpins our common life: reverence for the divine order and for the human person. That's not just for citizens, but also for lawmakers, judges and lawyers too. These priests of justice, as Ulpian called them, must do more than make and enforce rules. They must go beyond mechanical justice to equity and even love. Asking legal professionals to be great lovers might seem too much, especially when we consider some of the characters they must deal with. Yet if love without justice can be too partial, justice without charity can be too harsh, in the ways our scriptures warn against. So we demonise others as enemies, cancelling and trolling them, feeding an endless cycle of vengeance in this culture of indignation. Many years ago, we all read Terence Rattigan's play, The Winslow Boy, or saw it on stage or film. It's the story of a young naval cadet accused of stealing a postal order and his father's fight through the courts to prove his innocence with the help of London's top advocate, Sir Robert Morton. But Rattigan never takes us into the court. Instead, we see the effects of the proceedings on people outside. In the final scene, we hear that the great barrister wept in court at the vindication of his client's innocence. When the family's suffragette daughter, Catherine, asks him if he wept for justice, Sir Robert replies, "No, not justice, right. It's easy to do justice, very hard to do right." This captures something of what Moses, Jesus, and John Paul meant when they spoke of a justice that seeks mercy, even love. Unless we find a way to reverence even those who are hardest to love, we cannot bring the impartiality necessary for right judgment. And we cannot sustain the kind of character and common life that the law is there to instill and serve. From my memories of my law school days, there wasn't much talk of love of enemies, prayers for persecutors, or seeking heavenly perfection. Yet as Jesus reminds us today, God, the perfect judge, causes the sun to rise on bad men as well as good, and his rain to fall on honest and dishonest men alike, demonstrating an impartiality between persons that is hard to achieve, and yet a partiality towards each person as another self. This repudiation of contempt and determination to see the good and true and beautiful in the other is foundational for our civil life. It must be a guarding light for priests of justice. God bless you in your important work.